They were called the Divine Wind, men chosen to crash their planes into enemy ships, sacrificing everything for the Emperor. But as Japan's skies filled with smoke and chaos, a terrifying rumor spread among the kamikaze squadrons. There was a new kind of American ship waiting beyond the waves, small, fast, and impossible to surprise. The radar Picket destroyers. Pilots said their instruments jammed before reaching them, that unseen waves in the air spotted them long before their final dive. Many never made it close enough to see the ship that killed them. For the first time, the hunters became the hunted. These destroyers weren't just machines, they were silent watchers, invisible eyes piercing through the clouds. And for the kamikaze, they became something worse than death itself. The enemy that could see them coming. By 1945, the Pacific was a graveyard of burning ships and broken men. Japan, cornered and desperate, unleashed its final weapon, human sacrifice. The kamikaze were young pilots, barely trained, told that crashing their planes into American ships would bring honor to their families and salvation to their nation. They took off knowing they would never return. But what they didn't expect was that the Americans had built something new, a deadly line of ships stretching across the ocean like a wall of steel and lightning. These were the radar Picket destroyers, the Navy's silent sentinels. Positioned miles ahead of the main fleet, they served as the eyes of the American Armada, detecting incoming planes before anyone else could. For the kamikaze, these destroyers were not just obstacles, they were nightmares. Every radar pulse meant exposure, every signal meant death. In the endless sky, the hunters of Japan had finally met the guardians of America. The question wasn't who was braver. It was who would survive long enough to be remembered. In the final years of World War II, Japan's empire was collapsing under the relentless advance of Allied forces. Island after island had fallen. American bombers darkened the skies over Tokyo. The once proud Imperial Navy was shattered, its carriers sunk, its fuel reserves dwindling to almost nothing. Yet even in defeat, the Japanese military refused to surrender. Out of desperation, they turned to an ancient idea, one rooted in the code of the samurai, death before dishonor. The word kamikaze meant divine wind, a name drawn from the legendary typhoon that had once saved Japan from Mongol invasion centuries before. Now, that same divine wind was reborn, not as a storm of nature, but as young men willing to die in flames. They were told their sacrifice would turn the tide of war, that their deaths would protect the emperor and the homeland. It was not a choice, it was a destiny written for them. Many were students, barely 20 years old, pulled from universities and trained for only a few weeks before being sent to airfields in the Philippines, Okinawa, and Kyushu. They wrote farewell letters, posed for final photographs, and shared quiet meals with comrades who would soon be gone. In those final nights, their faces glowed under lantern light, a haunting mix of pride and terror. Each kamikaze pilot carried not just explosives, but a nation's broken hope. They were told to fly straight into the enemy, to aim for aircraft carriers and destroyers, and to never hesitate. In their minds, dying was no longer tragedy, it was purpose. Propaganda painted their mission as sacred. Commanders spoke of rebirth in the afterlife, of becoming divine spirits who would protect Japan from above. But reality was far colder than honor or faith. Many pilots took off knowing their aircraft were poorly maintained, their engines unreliable, and their targets heavily defended. As they climbed into the sky, their hearts pounded with the weight of duty, and fear they could never admit. Because deep down, even the bravest among them wondered. Would their deaths really change anything? Or were they simply being sent to die for a dream already lost? The divine wind was gathering, but what awaited them beyond the horizon was something no training, no code, and no belief could prepare them for. As the Japanese prepared their kamikaze squadrons, the Americans were fighting their own battle, one not only of courage, but of survival through innovation. By early 1945, U.S. forces had learned a brutal truth during the Pacific Campaign: every island gained brought them closer to Japan, but also within range of suicidal air attacks. The Battle of Okinawa would become the ultimate test. To protect their massive invasion fleet from waves of incoming kamikazes, the U.S. Navy designed a new kind of defense, the radar picket line. It was a deadly ring of destroyers stretched miles ahead of the main fleet, positioned like lonely outposts on the vast, restless sea. Their job was to detect enemy aircraft long before they reached the invasion force. These ships were not large or heavily armored. They were agile and fast, but terrifyingly exposed. Often stationed alone, each picket destroyer became the first to see the enemy and the first to die. Their radar screens glowed through the night, sweeping the skies for the faintest signal of incoming planes. Every blip on the monitor meant danger. Every faint echo could mean a kamikaze diving from the clouds. Life aboard a picket destroyer was pure tension. The men slept with one ear open, knowing an alarm could sound at any second. Many sailors called their stations suicide posts, because the destroyers took the first hit of every attack. Yet they stood their ground. If the radar failed, the entire fleet could be caught off guard, and thousands would die. Off Okinawa, 20 radar picket stations formed a thin, fragile barrier. Destroyers like USS Laffey, USS Bush, and USS Morrison faced the full fury of the kamikaze assault. On some days, they fought off more than 50 incoming aircraft, filling the sky with fire and smoke. Pilots who survived the chaos told stories of ships that seemed impossible to destroy, surrounded by explosions yet still firing back. The men on those decks were young too, no older than the pilots charging toward them. But while the kamikazes fought for death, these sailors fought for every breath. Their only allies were radar, steel, and courage. The ocean became their battlefield, their isolation their shield. And as the radar waves rippled through the air, invisible and unstoppable, they began to earn a new reputation among their enemies. Not as ordinary ships, but as ghosts that could see death coming long before it arrived. April 16, 1945. Dawn broke over the Pacific in a haze of mist and gunpowder. The sea was calm, but every sailor aboard the radar picket destroyers knew what that silence meant. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japan's kamikaze squadrons were already in the air, hundreds of planes, fueled by desperation and fate, headed straight for them. The alarms began to wail just after sunrise. Radar operators shouted coordinates as green dots appeared on the screens, small at first, then multiplying fast. Inbound bogies, range 30 miles. The destroyers sprang to life. Guns swiveled, ammunition belts clattered, and sailors scrambled to battle stations. The sky above Okinawa was about to become a storm of death. At 8:45 a.m., the first wave descended. Dozens of Japanese aircraft streaked through the clouds, sunlight flashing off their wings. From a distance, they looked like silver insects, but as they drew closer, their purpose became clear. Kamikazes. Each one carried enough explosives to tear a destroyer in half. The USS Laffey, codenamed the ship that would not die, was one of the first to make contact. Surrounded and isolated, she faced an onslaught that seemed endless. Within minutes, she was attacked by more than 22 aircraft. Bombs exploded around her hull. One plane crashed into her aft gun mount, another tore through her radar mast, setting the deck ablaze. Yet the crew fought on. Machine guns chattered, 5-inch cannons thundered, and smoke cloaked the deck like a funeral shroud. Aboard the ship, men screamed orders through burning air. The heat from the flames was suffocating, but they refused to abandon their posts. Even when ammunition ran low, even when fuel tanks were leaking fire, the Laffey kept fighting. Her radar stayed active, her guns kept firing. Up above, the kamikaze pilots pushed forward through chaos. Some shouted prayers. Others closed their eyes, gripping the photo of a mother or child taped to the instrument panel. They had been told these ships were easy targets, but they found themselves flying into walls of anti-aircraft fire that shredded their planes before they could even aim. The ocean boiled with the fury of two nations. Kamikazes plunged like meteors, their engines howling as tracer fire tore the sky apart. When they hit, the shockwaves shook the water for miles. Those who missed circled back, determined to die trying. For every destroyer that burned, another held the line. For every sailor who fell, a comrade took his place at the gun. By sunset, the sky was a graveyard of twisted metal and smoke, drifting across a blood-red sea. That day, the kamikazes learned the truth: the radar Picket destroyers were not prey. They were predators cloaked in lightning, waiting in silence for the storm to come. By mid-1945, whispers began spreading through the kamikaze units stationed across Kyushu and Okinawa. The young pilots, once filled with religious conviction and patriotic pride, now spoke of something new: fear. Not fear of death itself, but of the ships that could see them coming. When Japan's intelligence officers began debriefing the few pilots who survived aborted missions, they noticed the same pattern in their stories. Pilots reported being targeted long before they reached American ships. "They knew exactly where we were," one survivor said. "Even when we came from the clouds, they were already firing." The Americans, it seemed, had developed an invisible eye that pierced the sky: radar. The radar Picket destroyers became a myth among the kamikaze squadrons. Some pilots refused to believe it. Others swore they had seen it with their own eyes: ships that lit up the heavens with tracer fire the moment a plane crossed the horizon. They said the destroyers were haunted, guided by unseen spirits, or perhaps by the souls of the dead who would not allow Japan's divine wind to blow again. For those who did believe, dread began to replace devotion. The moment they climbed into their cockpits, their bodies trembled, not from cold, but from the realization that their deaths might mean nothing. Many missions ended before they began: engines failed, coordinates were lost, or planes disappeared into the sea without striking a single target. Each failure chipped away at the illusion of divine purpose. The Americans had turned technology into terror. Their radar systems, once mere instruments, became the psychological weapons that broke the will of their enemies. Japanese pilots began taking longer routes, flying lower to avoid detection, and even launching at night, but nothing worked. Every time they thought they had found a blind spot, the destroyers were there, waiting, already locked on. In one recorded incident, a kamikaze pilot flying toward Okinawa radioed back moments before disappearing into the clouds. "The sea glows with their fire, they know we are here." Those words haunted the few who heard them. The divine wind, that once symbolized heavenly protection, now carried only the smell of burning fuel and despair. Back on the airfields, commanders still preached honor and destiny, but the pilots knew better. They had seen the truth written in the sky: that courage meant nothing against an enemy who could see your death coming miles away. For the kamikaze, the end was no longer glorious. It was silent, invisible, and inevitable. The eyes of America had turned the heavens into a graveyard. The Battle of Okinawa became one of the bloodiest encounters in naval history. Between April and June 1945, nearly 2,000 Japanese planes, most of them kamikazes, hurled themselves against the Allied fleet. For both sides, it was a nightmare. The Americans endured endless days of fire and smoke, while the Japanese sacrificed thousands of their youngest sons to a war that could no longer be won. On the radar Picket destroyers, the price of heroism was steep. Each ship that held the line paid with blood. Crews worked in shifts so short that some never left their guns for days. Sleep was a luxury, food tasted like ash. The sound of approaching aircraft became a kind of clock, one that ticked toward either death or another narrow escape. When the USS Bush and USS Colhoun were struck within hours of each other, sailors aboard nearby destroyers watched in horror as both ships exploded, their decks vanishing under sheets of fire. Survivors were few, and those pulled from the water bore burns, broken bones, and the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen the face of death too closely. Letters sent home during those weeks painted a grim portrait of endurance. One gunner aboard the USS Laffey wrote, "Every sunrise feels like a gamble." We see the planes, we fire until our hands bleed, and somehow, we're still here. Another sailor confessed that he could still hear the sound of diving aircraft in his dreams, the high-pitched scream of engines moments before impact. Yet even amid the horror, courage never faltered. Damaged destroyers refused to retreat. Engineers patched holes in decks while shells were still exploding around them. Medics treated the wounded in corridors filled with smoke. When ammunition ran low, men carried shells by hand, their clothes burned and faces streaked with oil. The line never broke. The Americans called it duty. The Japanese called it honor. But in the chaos of those days, both words began to blur. The destroyer crews were not fighting for glory, they were fighting for survival, for the man beside them, for a world where no one would have to face what they were facing again. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, 36 U.S. ships had been sunk, and more than 4,900 sailors were dead. Japan had lost far more, nearly 3,000 pilots gone, their sacrifice swallowed by the sea. And yet, the radar Picket destroyers had held. Their technology had saved the fleet. Their endurance had broken the will of the Kamikaze. But victory came at a price that could never be measured in medals. Because on those lonely stations in the Pacific, every survivor carried the same haunting truth: sometimes, even in victory, war leaves only ghosts behind. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the Pacific was a vast cemetery of wreckage and memory. The war that had consumed nations ended not with glory, but with exhaustion. Japan lay in ruins, its cities burned, its youth buried in the sea. For the Kamikaze pilots, their final acts were remembered not as victories, but as tragedies, desperate gestures of a dying empire. And for the American sailors who survived the radar picket line, victory came shadowed by the ghosts of those who didn't make it home. In the years that followed, the story of the radar picket destroyers became one of courage that bordered on myth. Naval historians called them the eyes of the fleet, yet those who had stood on their decks knew the truth: they were also its shields, bleeding first so others could live. Technology had given them an edge, but it was human endurance that turned that edge into survival. The invention of radar changed warfare forever. What had begun as a crude experiment in radio detection had evolved into a weapon of foresight. It turned invisible waves into warnings, seconds into salvation. The same technology that once saved ships from kamikazes would go on to guide aircraft, missiles, and even spacecraft. But it also raised a deeper question: when man gains the power to see his enemy before the enemy can see him, does it make war safer, or simply colder? For the Japanese people, the memory of the kamikaze became a wound that time refused to heal. In the decades after the war, many of their families struggled to reconcile faith with futility. Memorials were built, not to glorify, but to mourn. At the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, tablets still bear the names of the young men who flew into eternity believing they were saving their homeland. And across the ocean, in American naval museums, the battered relics of radar picket ships rest in quiet dignity, rusting steel that once stood between life and annihilation. Today, the ocean that once roared with fire is calm again. The waves wash over forgotten wrecks, carrying whispers of courage, fear, and sacrifice. The kamikaze and the destroyer crews, enemies once separated by ideology, are now bound by a single truth: they were all human, caught in a storm larger than themselves. In the end, both sides looked into the same sky, searching for the same thing: a way home that no radar could ever find. As the years passed and the world began to rebuild, the stories of those who lived and died in the Pacific slowly faded into history books. But for the men who stood watch on the radar picket destroyers and the young kamikaze pilots who dove from the sky, their memories never truly disappeared. They lived on in quiet photographs, in folded letters stained by sea water, in the trembling voices of the few who survived to tell what they had seen. When you strip away the politics, the propaganda, and the flags, what remains is the same fragile truth: both sides were made of boys who dreamed of peace, who were taught that dying for their nation was the highest honor. Some believed their deaths would protect their families. Others believed survival was their duty to them. Both were right, and both were wrong. The kamikaze's final descent and the sailor's last stand were two sides of the same coin, courage wrapped in tragedy. Each believed the other was the monster, yet both were victims of the same unrelenting machine called war. History often remembers victory in numbers, ships sunk, enemies destroyed, missions completed. But the true measure of war's cost lies not in statistics, but in the silence that follows the gunfire. The waves that once carried fire now carry only reflection. The radar screens are dark, the engines silent. Yet somewhere, deep beneath those same Pacific waters, the spirits of enemies and brothers drift together, proof that even in war's darkest hour, humanity never completely disappears. Because in the end, it was not radar or steel that defined them. It was the courage to face the impossible, and the hope that someday, no one else would have to.